Shadow Defence Secretary, thanks for joining us. What is your party's take on potentially putting boots on the ground in Ukraine after peace has been delivered as a peacekeeping mission?
Good morning. Yeah, I mean, it's important to clarify. Obviously, no one is talking about doing that now because I think the public might be forgiven for not entirely understanding that. We're talking about, as you say, if there were some hypothetical peace deal where there needed to be peacekeeping troops, we certainly wouldn't rule out supporting that. I mean, our position is, as you know, we stood by Ukraine as a government right at the outset of the invasion, played a fundamental role in supporting Ukraine, and in opposition, we've continued to stand shoulder to shoulder with Labour. There's a very strong parliamentary consensus about the need to support Ukraine. So clearly, we intend to keep doing that. All I would say is, I think when you talk about, putting boots on the ground, that's a pretty big step to go from supplying weapons to actually having our people there. And of course, for that to happen, we do need to know a bit more. We'd want to know what the terms of engagement were and so on, what the role of the US would be. And so I think, I understand why people are discussing this. For us at the moment, the real focus should be on two key areas, really. Number one, it's vital that Ukraine has a principal voice in these negotiations. They are the country which has suffered, invaded without provocation, its people, traumatized by casualties on a vast scale, both civil and military. And the second point is, as you alluded to about the military side at home, we must increase defense spending, and not just that, actually get on with it. Because we've wasted months in this country. The government could have been placing orders for the munitions we need, not just to replenish what we've gifted to Ukraine, quite rightly, but also to deal with the new technological threats we face, such as ballistic missiles. So, I do urge the government to get on with that and to really focus on ramping up our defence.
I mean, there's so much to get to, but it's the same with your colleague Alicia Kearns yesterday. You're blaming this government for wasting months on not spending more on defence. You wasted years.
I don't agree with that. First of all, let's just look at the facts. Defence spending has been falling since 1985, and when the Cold War started to thaw under Gorbachev, it was around 5%. It went to 4% in the early 90s, 3% under us in 1996, 2.5% on Labour by the end of 2010. We then had that terrible financial crash, very difficult period for the public finances. But as the threat picture started to re-emerge in terms of nation-on-nation threat rather than just counter-terror, we were the first government to significantly increase spending post the Cold War, which was back in 2019 under Boris Johnson. It went to 2.3%, which is actually above the NATO target then. And at the election, we had a plan to increase it further to 2.5%. It was ready to go. We were going to reduce the civil service back to its pre-pandemic size. And and let me just key point. I was a defence procurement minister at the time. The key thing is about speed and giving the MOD a multi-year plan. If you can do that, they can order the munitions at the scale and pace we need. The uncertainty we've had from Labour, they've not been able to do that, and procurement has effectively been on hold.
But you left this government with it at 2.3% of GDP, where it stands today. Your plan was to boost it to 2.5% by 2030. So 5-6 months in, it would not have increased in any meaningful way for what was a 7-year plan to get it up 0.2%. Yes, things have changed. They've changed enormously in the last couple of weeks. So, in 6 months, if there's no reaction, the points you're making might have some legitimacy, but they don't, sitting here now as you do.
So in terms of the plan we set out, as I said, what really mattered about it is it gave multi-year certainty to the Ministry of Defence. They could have placed those orders for all of the munitions we need. This is desperately important. We have stocks that are below what are needed for warfighting capability. If you order a Storm Shadow missile, it doesn't arrive tomorrow on Amazon, right? It takes a few years to appear. So the crucial thing is by laying out that multi-year plan, we could have placed those orders. It was an extra £10 billion for munitions. That's the crucial point. So by every month you delay setting out your plan to increase defence spending, you delay the procurement and when those items will arrive in our inventory. And that's what really matters, because if we're going to be, for many years now, and I fear, it will be some time, we remain in this heightened position of threat in Europe, we need to get on with restocking, and that's what we would have done.
But why didn't you place the orders? You had 14 years.
Well, first of all, I mean, obviously, we lost the general election and Labour became the government. We had a plan ready to go. I personally was heavily involved in drawing up the munition strategy to start replacing the inventory. We did order a massive order for 155 shells, which is the core munition of our artillery. I placed a significant order for air defence, which is what we call GBAD, ground-based air defence. And we had set out a plan for an additional £10 billion on top of what's already budgeted for in the equipment plan to increase munitions. Obviously, we didn't win the general election, fair enough. But that plan was ready to go. Labour took a definitive choice not to put that into motion. They decided to hold the strategic defence review. In my view, that delayed the necessary decision to restock, which they will end up making now, many months later.
What's the entire defence budget? How big is it?
Well, at the moment, there is no public equipment plan, but it's about 2.3% of GDP.
But how big is it in monetary terms?
Last time I looked, it was over £50 billion. I think it went over 50 for the first time under us. The crucial thing is that over a multi-year period, you have an equipment plan well above £200 billion. We would have added significantly to that through our spending plan. And I just want to, if I may, go back to your point.
But forgive me, you just over £200 billion, and you said you were going to do an extra 10. I mean, it's not game changing. What is game-changing is the rhetoric from the US in the last couple of weeks. And this is something where there could have been unity between the two major parties to agree that more needs to be done, that it's nobody's fault, and that you could back them to get to that point. And my point for picking you up on this and losing the whole interview to it is the fact that you suggest the only reason we are where we are is because of the last couple of months, when essentially defence spend is exactly the same portion of GDP as you left it a few months ago. We've been derailed
all,
on.
If I may get a chance to reply to your points. Number one, you're saying £10 billion wouldn't be transformative. I can assure you, the munitions that would have ordered would have been transformative for our military. It would have included not just the shells and missiles that replenish what we've currently got. We have faced very serious threats directly. I'm not talking about in Ukraine, where we are providing munitions indirectly, if you like. We're not actually involved in the fight. But we have had our own naval personnel in the Red Sea, and we've seen how the Houthis have been trying to obtain ballistic missiles to strike at our ships. They need to have maritime air defence, which is of the highest calibre. So, for example, our plan would have included accelerating the Sea Viper evolution, which is a big upgrade to our maritime air defence. So, yes, it would have been transformative. But you seem to be making quite an odd argument. I'm saying to you that had we won, and I accept that was unlikely, but had our plan been implemented in July, when we said it should have been, we would have already started placing those orders. I think that's the right thing to have done. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. But as to your point that there's no consensus, we have been 100% in supporting the government on Ukraine. There is a strong consensus in Parliament. I think John Healey, if he was in front of you, would agree with that.
Well, I'm not making an argument. I'm pushing back on your argument, which was to suggest that the lack of spending on defence in general and the state of the defences is something that a party that's been in government for 6 months is responsible for when it's a long-term issue, as opposed to the party that was in government for 14 years. But I think we've kind of covered that issue at length, and we're kind of almost out of time. I want to come back to the second question I was going to ask, and in your first answer, you alluded to some of the things that you'd like to see happen, so much of which rests on the United States. And in that regard, are you pleased that the Prime Minister will be going to meet President Trump next week? And do you wish him every success in convincing President Trump of those UK points of view that you highlighted?
Of course, we want to see Ukraine playing a principal role in these negotiations. That's fundamentally important. For me, there are two key priorities at the moment. Ukraine to have a big say, because they are the country that was invaded, its people slaughtered, bombed relentlessly, etc., without any provocation by an aggressive dictatorship. So we strongly support the Prime Minister on that. But on the second priority is about our own defence. And I appreciate that this isn't an argument, but you've made some points that I don't agree with. So if I may just make one really critical point. You said about the state of the armed forces. As I said, we gave a huge amount of our inventory to Ukraine. We gave them the AS-90, our artillery. We gave them Storm Shadow missiles. We gave them tanks. So obviously, there are now deficiencies in our military that we have to deal with, and we set out a plan to deal with them. So when you blame us, remember what you're blaming us for is in part standing by Ukraine and ensuring they weren't conquered by Russia early in that fight, which I think was the right thing to do. We've supported Ukraine then. We'll continue to do that in opposition by supporting the government.
I don't blame you. I push back on you blaming a government that's been in power for 6 months when you were in power for 14 years. But anyway, we're out of time.
But in that time, they've made choices, right? So if you look, they haven't placed those orders I was talking about. They've delayed procurement. Actually, what they are doing, the defence industry has a national insurance bill, this Parliament, of £600 million. So they have made decisions in those months which have had an impact.
They have.
And we hold them to account for that as
Shadow Defence Secretary, the state of the military overall right now,
Yep.
Who is more responsible for it? The party that is in government for 14 years. You yourself have said how long it takes to spend money and get results in defence. Who is more responsible for the current state of the military? The party that was in government for 14 years until 6 months ago, or the party that's been in government for 6 months?
So I am saying we are responsible for the actions we took to stand by Ukraine, which have had clearly an impact on our inventory, because we gave them missiles, we gave them tanks, artillery. We actually 500,000 shells. Now, not all of them were from our inventory, but 500,000 artillery shells. That's had an impact. And we had a plan to deal with that. And if it had been affected in July, when I said it should have been, when I became Shadow Defence Secretary, this country would be in a better position. And the government need to be held to account for that because they made a choice on that. They've brought forward taxes like national insurance, which is going to hit the defence industry, instead of firing up our defence industry with the orders they should have been placing. So I do hold them to account for that. But as I said to you, I do support the Prime Minister in going to see the President. We agree on both sides of the House about the need to stand by Ukraine. We want them to have a strong voice in these negotiations. They're my priorities, and we will continue both to hold the government to account on getting out that money, placing the orders, procuring so that we strengthen our armed forces, but we also support them very strongly in the way that we want to ensure Ukraine has a fair and strong shout in these negotiations.
But seemingly take no responsibility for 14 years of action. I note that you didn't answer the question. We are out of time. James Cartlidge, thank you very much for your time this morning.